There's a photograph from 1951. A young woman in silver and diamonds standing beside a man in military dress. Snow falling outside. Everyone said it was a blessing. They called her the most beautiful woman in the world. She was 18 when she became a queen, and 25 when they took it all away. This is the story of a woman who had everything except the one thing that mattered. A story of love that wasn't enough, of a life spent paying for something that was never her fault. Her name was Soraya, and what happened to her would make the whole world weep. The Rare Pearl. Isfahan, June 22nd, 1932. Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari was born in the English missionary hospital with eyes that would change her destiny. Her father, Khalil Esfandiari Bakhtiari, came from one of Iran's most powerful families. The Bakhtiaris were tribal nobility, the kind of bloodline that opened doors and commanded respect across the country. Her grandfather had been a revolutionary leader during Iran's constitutional movement. Her uncle was a senator. This was a family that understood power, but Soraya's mother was different. Eva Karl was German, born in Russia, raised in Moscow before her family fled to Berlin. She met Khalil when he was sent to Germany to study, far from the political machinations of Iran. Eva was blonde, European, with ideas about how to raise children that had nothing to do with Persian tradition. Their daughter was born with the best and worst of both worlds. In Persian culture, the firstborn should be a son. It brings honor to the father, admiration for the mother. But Khalil and Eva were enlightened enough not to care about such things. They had a healthy, beautiful daughter with striking blue-green eyes and golden skin. She was enough. Soraya spent her childhood between two countries, two cultures, two entirely different sets of expectations. In Isfahan, there was heat and dust and the weight of family legacy. In Berlin, there were parks and parties and a freedom that Iranian society would never quite allow. She learned to speak French and German fluently alongside Persian. She wrote poetry. She loved animals, keeping a yellow canary and a mischievous fox terrier in their Berlin home. She played Sleeping Beauty in a children's theatre production near one of Berlin's many lakes, and even at that young age, she found being awakened by a prince's kiss extremely pleasant. The family moved often. When political tensions made Iran dangerous for the Bakhtiaris, Khalil would take them to Berlin. When war made Europe impossible, they'd return to Isfahan. Soraya grew up understanding that nowhere was truly home, that safety was always temporary. By the time she was a teenager, she'd been educated at the finest finishing schools in Switzerland. She spoke several languages. She knew which fork to use at formal dinners and how to carry herself in any social situation. She was being prepared for something, though no one had quite told her what. In 1948, she was studying English in London. 16 years old, beautiful in that way that makes people stare, completely unaware that her photograph was about to change everything. But in Tehran, in the royal palace, people were looking for someone, and they were about to find her. The search. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shah of Iran, needed a wife. His first marriage had ended badly. Princess Fawzia of Egypt had given him a daughter, Shahnaz, but no son. The marriage crumbled under the weight of court politics and cultural differences. Fawzia returned to Egypt, and the Shah was alone again, ruling a country that desperately needed an heir. His mother, Queen Taj ol-Muluk, took matters into her own hands. She was a formidable woman, the kind who ran the palace with an iron will disguised as maternal concern. She'd dominated her son's life since childhood, and she wasn't about to let him choose his own bride. She consulted Foro Zafar Bakhtiari, a close family friend and distant relative of the Esfandiari clan. Surely, she suggested, among all the Bakhtiari families, there must be a suitable girl. Someone young, beautiful, from good bloodlines. Someone who could give the Shah what he needed. Forozafar began her search. She remembered that her niece Gamar had recently returned from Europe and mentioned meeting a cousin's daughter in Switzerland. The girl's name was Soraya. She was apparently very beautiful, well-educated, and spoke several languages. But Soraya wasn't in Switzerland anymore. She was in London, polishing her English, completely unaware that her name was being discussed in palace rooms thousands of miles away. A photograph was arranged. Not a casual snapshot, but a proper portrait taken by Gudaz Bakhtiari. In it, Soraya looked like something out of a dream. Those eyes, that face, the kind of beauty that couldn't be taught or bought. The photograph made its way to Princess Shams, the Shah's older sister. She was in London at the time, attending embassy functions and searching for exactly this kind of opportunity. When she saw Soraya's photograph, she knew immediately. This girl was perfect, more than perfect. She was, as Shams would later say, a rare pearl. Shams arranged to meet Soraya in person at a party at the Iranian embassy. The girl was even more striking in real life. 16 years old, poised, with that half-Persian, half-German elegance that seemed exotic and familiar all at once. Shams sent word back to Tehran. She'd found Iran's new queen. What no one asked was whether Soraya wanted to be found. The magnificent moment. The invitation came swiftly. Would Soraya and her father like to visit Tehran? Just a casual trip to see the palace, meet the family, nothing formal. But everyone knew what it really was. An audition. Soraya arrived in Tehran with her father in 1948. She was 16 years old and terrified, though she'd never admit it. The palace was overwhelming. Marble and gold and servants everywhere, watching, judging. This wasn't Berlin or Isfahan. This was the center of an empire. And then Mohammad Reza walked into the room. He wore his military uniform, pressed and perfect. At 32 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd been raised to rule. But there was something else, too, a melancholy in his eyes, a loneliness that Soraya recognized because she felt it too. She would later describe him as magnificent. Love struck her like lightning, the way it does when you're 16 and standing in a palace and a Shah is looking at you like you're the only person in the world. For Mohammad Reza, the feeling was mutual. He'd seen beautiful women before. The palace was full of them. But Soraya was different. She had substance beneath the beauty, intelligence, fire. She didn't simper or flatter. She looked him in the eye. The very next day, Khalil Esfandiari received news. The Shah wanted to marry his daughter, right away. Did she agree? Khalil asked Soraya the question carefully. Are you ready to marry him? This is a decision you can't undo. Soraya, young and in love, and dizzy with the impossible speed of it all, said yes. She had no idea what she was agreeing to. The Snow Bride. They were engaged in 1950. The Shah presented her with a 22.37-carat diamond ring that caught the light like a captured star. Newspapers around the world published their photograph. The young Shah and his beautiful bride-to-be. A modern fairy tale for a new era. The wedding was planned for December 27th, 1950. Invitations were sent. Preparations began. The world was ready to witness a royal spectacle. Then Soraya fell ill with typhoid fever, bedridden for weeks with a fever that wouldn't break. She was 18 years old and thought she might die before ever becoming a queen. Legend says the Shah visited her every day during her illness, leaving a jewel on her pillow each time. building a treasure pile beside a sick girl who couldn't even sit up. Whether it's true or palace mythology doesn't really matter. It's the kind of story people wanted to believe about them: the devoted Shah and his suffering bride, love conquering illness, romance waiting patiently for health to return. When she finally recovered, thin and weak but alive, they set a new date: February 12th, 1951. That morning, snow fell on Tehran, heavy, unexpected snow that blanketed the city in white. In a country where snow was rare, especially in the capital, it felt like divine intervention. The Iranians saw it as an omen, a blessing from heaven on the Union. Inside the marble palace, servants rushed to prepare for a ceremony that would be watched by the entire nation. The Shah ordered dozens of wood burners installed throughout the palace to fight the freezing cold. But it wasn't enough. The ancient building wasn't built for this kind of weather. Drafts swept through hallways. Windows rattled in their frames. The court doctor took one look at Soraya, still recovering from typhoid, and insisted she wear a woolen vest under her wedding dress, woolen socks under her skirts, anything to keep her warm enough to survive the ceremony. Christian Dior had been commissioned to design the gown. It arrived from Paris in a flurry of tissue paper and anticipation. But when they tried it on Soraya, everyone's faces fell. The dress was too large, designed for the healthy young woman she'd been before the typhoid, not the thin, fragile girl she'd become. The weight of the fabric and the elaborate embroidery was crushing. She could barely stand in it. After weeks of illness, she was weak, and the gown felt like carrying the palace itself on her shoulders. But there was no time to alter it properly. The ceremony was hours away. She would have to manage. 2,000 guests filled the palace. Ministers and ambassadors, tribal leaders and foreign dignitaries, everyone who mattered in Iran and half the diplomatic corps of Europe. 1.5 tons of flowers had been flown in from the Netherlands, filling every room with blooms that clashed with the February cold. An equestrian circus from Rome provided entertainment, horses and performers, adding spectacle to an already overwhelming day. The gifts poured in from around the world. Joseph Stalin sent a mink coat and a desk set with black diamonds, as if trying to buy influence through wedding presents. President Harry Truman sent a crystal bowl engraved with good wishes. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth sent silver candlesticks that would sit in palace rooms Soraya would never feel comfortable in. The ceremony itself was a blur. Soraya stood beside Mohammad Reza in that too heavy dress, shivering despite the woolen undergarments, smiling for photographers who captured every angle for newspapers that would splash their faces across front pages worldwide. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a political statement. Iran was modern, powerful, looking toward the West while honoring its Persian traditions. The Shah's marriage to a half-German woman educated in Europe showed the world that Iran wasn't some backward desert kingdom. It was cosmopolitan, sophisticated, ready to take its place among the great nations. And at the center of it all was an 18-year-old girl in silver and diamonds, barely able to support the weight of her own gown, marrying a man she'd known for less than 2 years, becoming the queen of a country she barely understood. Soraya became Queen of Iran at 18 years old, standing in a freezing palace while snow fell outside and 2,000 people watched her every move. The snow kept falling throughout the ceremony, throughout the reception, throughout that first night as a married woman in a palace that would never quite feel like home. Everyone said it was a good omen, a blessing. But inside the palace, the warmth everyone expected never quite arrived. Not that day. Not in all the years that followed. From the first day, Soraya learned what it meant to marry into the Pahlavi family. The Shah's mother hated her, It was that simple and that brutal. Queen Taj ol-Muluk had dominated her son's life for decades, and she saw every wife as a rival for his affection. She'd treated Fawzia the same way, with constant snubbing and petty humiliations. Now it was Soraya's turn. The Shah's sisters joined in. They whispered about her German blood, her Catholic upbringing, her European manners. They found fault with everything, from how she walked, to how she spoke, to how she held her teacup. Religious leaders questioned whether a half-European girl who'd been raised Catholic was suitable to be queen of a Muslim country. The marriage had required special dispensation, and many traditionalists never quite accepted it. Soraya tried to ignore it all. She threw herself into charitable work, heading the family foundation that supported Iran's poor. She visited hospitals and orphanages. She connected with regular people in a way that court life tried to prevent. The Iranian people loved her for it. They saw her genuine warmth, her real concern for their welfare. But at home, in the palace, she was fighting battles on every front. The worst of it came from Ernest Perron, the Shah's Swiss best friend and private secretary. Soraya despised him immediately. She described him as a man who detested all women, who spread poison through the palace like a gardener planting weeds. Perron was, according to Soraya, cunning and perfidious, a Machiavellian figure who roused hatred and revelled in intrigue. The problem was that Mohammad Reza trusted Perron completely. Every morning, the two men met to discuss affairs of state in French. Perron's advice carried more weight than anyone else's, including Soraya's. She was the queen, but this Swiss secretary held the real power. The marriage that had started with such passion began to strain under these pressures. Mohammad Reza was caught between his wife and his mother, between his love for Soraya and his dependence on Perron. He withdrew into himself, somber and distressed. And then the political crisis came. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh began nationalizing Iran's oil industry and stripping power from the Shah. The country descended into chaos. Mohammad Reza fell into deep depression, paralyzed by indecision. Soraya watched her husband crumble, and she did what queens throughout history have done when their kings fail. She became stronger. One day, she confronted him directly. She demanded he stop moping around the palace and take action. She pushed him to launch a coup against Mossadegh's government. It was Lady Macbeth territory, a queen urging her husband to seize power by force. In August 1953, when the coup attempt initially failed and Mohammad Reza had to flee Iran briefly, Soraya went with him. They escaped to Rome, waiting to see if the monarchy would survive. It did. The coup succeeded. The Shah returned to Tehran in triumph. But the cost of all that stress, all that political maneuvering, all those months of uncertainty was starting to show. Soraya was exhausted, and she still hadn't done the one thing everyone expected of her. She hadn't given Iran an heir. The desperate years. The pressure started subtly. Questions from the Queen Mother about when she might expect a grandchild. Sideways comments from the Shah's sisters about the importance of producing a son. Then it became less subtle. Soraya wanted children. She and Mohammad Reza both did. But month after month, year after year, nothing happened. She sought treatment in Switzerland and France, consulting the best doctors money could buy. They ran tests, prescribed treatments, tried every medical intervention available in the 1950s. Nothing worked. The whispers grew louder. The queen is barren. She can't give the Shah an heir. What good is a queen who can't continue the dynasty? October 26, 1954. The Queen Mother threw a family dinner at the palace to celebrate the Shah's birthday. It should have been a joyful occasion. But a few days earlier, Soraya's doctor had confirmed what she already feared. She wasn't pregnant, and it might take years for an heir to arrive, if ever. Mohammad Reza was morose at the dinner. The weight of duty sat heavy on him. He'd just been told that his younger brother, Prince Ali Reza, wouldn't be attending. The prince had been delayed leaving a hunting party in the forests near the Caspian Sea. Ali Reza was next in line to the throne. If Soraya couldn't give Mohammad Reza a son, at least there was still an heir for the dynasty. The next day, everything changed. The plane carrying Prince Ali Reza back to Tehran crashed. There were no survivors. Iran became the only monarchy in the world without an heir. The Shah had no brothers now, only a daughter from his first marriage, and daughters couldn't inherit the throne. If he died, the Pahlavi dynasty would end. The pressure on Soraya became unbearable. She wasn't just failing as a wife anymore. She was failing the entire country, the impossible choice. By 1958, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Shah's mother was relentless. "You must have a son," she told her son. "It's your duty. If Soraya can't give you one, then take a second wife. Islamic law allows it. The constitution allows it. Do your duty to the dynasty." Mohammad Reza didn't want a second wife. He loved Soraya. By all accounts, she was his one true love, the woman who understood him in ways no one else did. But he was also the Shah of Iran, and the Shah needed an heir. He suggested a compromise. What if Soraya agreed to let him take a second wife? She would remain his first wife, his true queen. But he would marry another woman just long enough to produce a son. Soraya refused. Absolutely not. She believed in the sanctity of marriage. One husband, one wife. She wasn't going to share him. Mohammad Reza tried another approach. He told Soraya he would call a council of wise men to amend the constitution, to change the rules of succession so that perhaps his daughter could inherit, or his half-brother could be named heir. Soraya, who had never read the Iranian constitution, believed him. But there was no council of wise men. It didn't exist. The Shah was lying to her, putting off a decision he couldn't bear to make. In February 1958, he convinced Soraya to leave Iran for a while. Just temporarily, he said, while he worked out the constitutional issues. She should go stay with her parents in Germany. It would all be sorted out soon. Soraya knew in her heart that something was wrong. Before she left, a courtier noticed that she systematically put her house in order. She packed her most precious belongings. She burned all her personal papers. On February 14th, 1958, exactly 7 years after her wedding day, Soraya left Iran. She would never return. Soraya went first to the Shah's villa in St. Moritz, Switzerland. For a while, Mohammad Reza called her every day. Sweet calls, reassuring calls. Everything would work out. He just needed time. Then the calls stopped. She moved to her parents' home in Cologne, Germany, waiting, hoping, trying not to believe what her instincts were telling her. The Shah sent her uncle, Sardar Assad Bakhtiari, to convince her to come back to Iran and accept the second wife arrangement. Soraya refused to even see him. He sent General Yazdan Pana and his wife on 2 separate occasions. Soraya's mother received them, but Soraya wouldn't meet with them. The message they all brought was the same. Come back. Accept the second wife, or the Shah will be forced to divorce you. On March 5th, 1958, 9 days before the public announcement, Mohammad Reza called Soraya directly. This was her last chance. Would she accept a second wife? Soraya said no. According to her later accounts, she was blindsided when the announcement came. On March 14th, 1958, the palace released a statement. The Shah and Queen Soraya were divorcing. A council of advisors had met with the Shah to discuss the troubled marriage and the lack of an heir. Divorce was the only solution. A week later, on March 21st, the Persian New Year, a weeping Shah addressed the Iranian people on radio and television. He told them about the divorce. He said he would not remarry in haste. The British ambassador to Iran later reported that Soraya was the Shah's only true love, that he was a man at an emotional crossroads, happy to be able to marry again, unable to bring himself to face what he'd just done. From her parents' home in Germany, Soraya issued her own statement. She said that since the Shah deemed it necessary for his successor to be of direct male descent, she would sacrifice her own happiness for the future of the state and the welfare of the people. She consented to the separation. The divorce was finalized on April 6, 1958. Soraya was 25 years old. She'd been Queen of Iran for exactly 7 years. Every photograph of her was ordered removed from the streets. Her pictures were torn out of school books. The title of Queen was stripped away, though she was allowed to keep the designation Her Imperial Highness Princess Soraya of Iran. The Shah made sure she was well compensated. A $3 million penthouse apartment in Paris, a monthly allowance of $7,000, a 1958 Rolls-Royce Phantom 4, a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, jewellery from Bulgari, Van Cleef and Arpels, Harry Winston. He'd divorced her, but he bought her comfort. The world called it generous. Soraya called it exile. And the paparazzi, who followed her relentlessly through Europe for years afterward, gave her a new title: the sad-eyed princess, the actress. Soraya tried to build a new life. It was what everyone told her to do. Move forward. You're young. You're beautiful. You have money. The world is open to you. But the world didn't feel open. It felt like a series of closed doors, each one leading to another empty room. She settled in Paris, in that beautiful penthouse the Shah had bought her. $3 million of gilt made concrete and marble. The address was prestigious. The views were spectacular. The furnishings were exquisite. She hated every inch of it. Still, she tried. She attended society events, parties thrown by duchesses and counts, glittering gatherings where European nobility mingled with movie stars and industrialists. She wore her beautiful clothes and her famous jewels and smiled with a mouth that had forgotten how. People stared at her everywhere she went. The most famous divorcee in the world. The woman who couldn't give a king his heir. Beauty and tragedy wrapped together in designer dresses and borrowed smiles. They wanted to meet her, to touch her, to claim later they'd met the sad-eyed princess at so-and-so's party. She was an attraction, a curiosity, a cautionary tale walking among them in Dior gowns. She dated, trying to fill the void where her marriage used to be. There was Maximilian Schell, the Austrian actor with dark, good looks and intellectual intensity. For a while, people whispered that they might marry, but it never quite happened. Then Gunter Sachs, the industrial heir and photographer, rich and charming and part of the jet-set crowd that moved between Saint-Tropez and Gstaad. Another relationship that photographers documented and gossip columns dissected. Another man who couldn't quite fill the space left by a Shah. For a while, she lived in Munich, close to her German roots. Then she returned to Paris. Rootless, always moving, never quite belonging anywhere. The girl who'd grown up between two countries had become a woman who belonged to none. Producer Dino De Laurentiis approached her with an idea. Would she consider acting? He wanted to make a film about Catherine the Great, and Soraya would be perfect for the role. Another empress, another woman who'd wielded power in a man's world. The project fell through, tangled in financing and scheduling conflicts. But the idea of acting stuck with Soraya. Why not? She had nothing else to do. No country to serve, no husband to support, no children to raise. Maybe she could lose herself in pretending to be other people. Maybe it would be easier than being herself. In 1965, Soraya agreed to star in a film called I Tre Volti, The Three Faces. It was an anthology film, 3 stories by 3 different directors. She would appear in one segment, playing a role written specifically for her. She would use only her first name, just Soraya. No longer princess, no longer queen, just a woman trying something new. The film was ambitious. Michelangelo Antonioni directed one segment. Franco Indovina directed another. All serious filmmakers trying to create something artistic rather than commercial. De Laurentiis had one condition that seemed cruel in retrospect. Soraya wasn't allowed to smile in the film. The tale of the sad Empress, he believed, would be useful for advertising. Her tragedy was her selling point. Even in her new life, she was trapped by her old story. On set, she met Franco Indovina, the director of her segment. He was 40 years old, married, a father. But he had kind eyes and a gentle manner, and he treated Soraya like a collaborator rather than a curiosity. They fell in love the way people do on film sets, in that intense hothouse atmosphere where reality and fiction blur. Franco was everything the Shah hadn't been. He was an artist, not a politician. He cared about stories and images, not dynasties and heirs. He saw Soraya as a woman, not a symbol. He left his wife for her. She moved to Rome to be with him. For the first time since leaving Iran 7 years earlier, Soraya seemed genuinely happy. The paparazzi captured them together at restaurants, at film premieres, walking hand in hand through Roman streets. Franco didn't care about her royal past. He didn't whisper about her inability to have children. He loved her for who she was now, not who she'd failed to be. She made another film, a small role in She in 1965, playing a character named Soraya. The acting career was brief, never quite taking off the way De Laurentiis had hoped. The films weren't successful. Critics were mixed. Soraya was beautiful on screen, but beauty alone doesn't make an actress. But Soraya didn't care. She wasn't trying to become a star. She was trying to become a person again. She and Franco talked about marriage, about building a real life together, away from palaces and protocols and expectations she couldn't meet. Maybe they'd have a quiet wedding. Maybe they'd settle somewhere warm. Maybe they'd finally just be ordinary people who loved each other. It was May 5th, 1972. Franco had to fly to Sicily for a meeting about a new film project. Just a quick trip. He'd be back in 2 days. Soraya kissed him goodbye at the Rome airport, watching him walk toward the plane that would carry him to Palermo. Alitalia Flight 112 crashed on approach to Palermo airport. All 115 people aboard died. Franco Indovina was 40 years old. The Palace of Loneliness. After Franco's death, something in Soraya broke that never healed. She retreated into herself. The brief acting career ended. The society appearances became rarer. She lived in her Paris apartment, surrounded by memories and jewels and the ghosts of lives she'd almost lived. Depression consumed her, the kind that makes the world grey and distant, that steals colour from everything. She'd lost Franco the same way the Shah had lost his brother. A plane crash, random, senseless, unfair. Her friend Massimo Gargia tried to help. He organised parties, introduced her to young people, tried to bring light back into her life. But Soraya was slipping away into isolation. She wrote a memoir in 1991 called Le Palais des Solitudes, The Palace of Loneliness. In it, She admitted that she'd suffered from depression since Franco's death, nearly 20 years of living in a beautiful prison of her own making. The title was perfect. She'd lived in actual palaces once, surrounded by servants and courtiers and the trappings of royalty. Now she lived in a different kind of palace, luxurious and expensive and utterly empty. She still received that monthly allowance from Iran, though it stopped when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah in 1979. The new regime had no interest in supporting the former Shah's divorced wife. When Soraya heard that Mohammad Reza was dying in 1980, she wrote to him. After all these years, she still loved him. She wanted to see him one last time. The Shah wanted to see her too. His wife, Farah, the woman he'd married after Soraya and who had given him the son he needed, understood. She agreed that she wouldn't be present during their final meeting, but the meeting never happened. Mohammad Reza died on July 27, 1980, in Cairo. Exiled from his own country, fallen from power, broken by cancer. He was 60 years old. Soraya was in Paris when she heard the news. The man she'd met at 16, married at 18, divorced at 25, was gone. The British ambassador's words echoed through the years. Soraya was the Shah's only true love, and he was hers. The mysterious end. Soraya lived alone in Paris for another 21 years. She ventured out occasionally to social events, elegant affairs organised by her friend, the Duchess de la Rochefoucauld. She maintained appearances, dressed beautifully, smiled in photographs. But people who knew her said she was increasingly absent even when present, lost in memories of Isfahan and Tehran, of a young man in a military uniform, of snow falling on her wedding day. On October 25, 2001, at the age of 69, Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari was found in her Paris apartment. She was gone. The cause was never determined, never disclosed. No autopsy was made public. No official explanation was ever given. Some said it was natural causes. Others whispered about the pills prescribed for her depression. A few suggested something darker, though nothing was ever proven. The mystery of her passing added one final layer to her tragic story. The sad-eyed princess had lived a life of unanswered questions, and she left the world with one more. A week after Soraya's passing, her younger brother Bijan died. The grief of losing his sister was more than he could bear. On November 6, 2001, Soraya's funeral was held at the American Cathedral in Paris. The Shah's twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi, attended. So did his half-brother, Prince Gholamreza Pahlavi. Representatives from the life she'd left behind decades ago. She was buried in the Westfriedhof Cemetery in Munich, alongside her parents. Later, Bijan was buried there too, the girl who'd been born with emerald eyes in Isfahan, who'd become a queen at 18, who'd been cast aside at 25, who'd spent 43 years living in exile from the only place that had ever truly been hers. She rested finally, away from cameras, away from expectations, away from the weight of being a symbol instead of a person. The legacy. Years after her passing, Soraya's story endures. French songwriter Françoise Mallet-Joris wrote a song inspired by her divorce. Je veux pleurer comme Soraya. I want to cry like Soraya. It became a hit, turning her pain into poetry. A rose was named after her. The Empress Soraya, bred by French rose grower François Meilland. A flower to commemorate a woman who'd been plucked from one garden and withered in another. In 2003, an Italian-German television movie told her story, with Anna Vale playing Soraya and Errol Sander as the Shah. They tried to capture the tragedy, the beauty, the impossible choices. Books were written. articles published. Her jewelry went to auction, fetching millions. The diamonds that had once adorned a queen sold to private collectors who would never know the weight of wearing them. Social media in Iran discovered her in the 2010s. A new generation, born long after the revolution, found her photographs online. They shared images of her emerald eyes, her perfect face, her elegant clothes. They called her the most beautiful woman in history. But beauty wasn't what destroyed Soraya. Duty destroyed her. The expectation that a woman's worth was measured in the sons she could produce. The ancient idea that a queen who couldn't give an heir had failed at her only real purpose. She'd been charitable and kind. She'd connected with the Iranian people in ways that mattered. She'd supported her husband through political crises that might have toppled his throne. She'd loved him genuinely, completely. None of it was enough. Because she couldn't do the one thing that biology and bad luck had made impossible. The Shah remarried in 1959, less than 18 months after divorcing Soraya. His third wife, Farah Diba, was 21 years old. Within a year, she gave him a son. Crown Prince Reza was born on October 31st, 1960. Everything Soraya had lost her crown for trying to provide. When the Islamic Revolution came in 1979, it swept away the entire Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah fled into exile with Farah and their children. He died in Cairo a year later, sick and broken and far from home. The son he'd needed so desperately never got to inherit the throne. The heir, who'd cost Soraya everything, was still a teenager when his father's kingdom collapsed. All of it. The divorce, the heartbreak, the sacrifice, had been for nothing. Soraya knew this. She lived long enough to see the Shah die in exile, to see the monarchy fall, to see the cruel irony of history's judgment. She spent her final decades in that Paris apartment, surrounded by luxury that couldn't buy happiness, beauty that couldn't erase loneliness, memories of a love that had consumed her entire life and left her with nothing but ghosts. The sad-eyed princess, the queen of sorrow, the woman who'd been cast aside for failing at something she'd never had control over. Her story is a reminder of what we do to women when we reduce them to their biological functions, when we measure their worth in heirs produced and dynasties continued, when we forget that behind the crown and the jewels and the photographs is a human being who can break. Soraya broke. Not all at once, but slowly, over decades, each loss adding another crack. Franco's death, the Shah's death, the years of exile, the weight of being famous for tragedy. She deserved better. She deserved to be remembered for her kindness, her strength during the Mossadegh crisis, her genuine care for Iran's poor, her courage in refusing to share her husband with another woman. Instead, she's remembered as the beautiful woman who couldn't have children, the Empress who was cast aside, the princess with the sad eyes. In the end, that's the real tragedy. Not that she lost her crown, not even that she lost her love, but that after everything she was and everything she did, history reduced her to what she couldn't be. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's a photograph of her from 1944. Green eyes staring through the camera, not at it. A face so perfectly arranged it almost doesn't look real. Jean Tierney, they said, was the most beautiful woman in movie history. But if you look closely at that photograph, really look, you can see something else entirely. Something haunted, something that knew what was coming. This is the story of a woman who had everything the world could offer and watched it all slip through her fingers like water. A story of fame and illness, of love and betrayal, of a single moment of kindness that would destroy two lives forever. The Gilded Cage. Brooklyn, November 19th, 1920. Jean Eliza Tierney arrived into a world that had already decided what she would become. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a successful insurance broker who moved in circles where money whispered instead of shouted. The Tierney home wasn't just wealthy, it was proper, the kind of proper that came with rules about which fork to use and which families were suitable for association. Her mother, Belle, had once taught physical education, moving through the world with purpose and strength. But marriage had transformed her into something else, a keeper of social codes and expectations. Now she taught her daughter different lessons: how to hold a teacup without making a sound, how to enter a room so every eye would turn, but no one could say why, how to laugh at a man's joke even when it wasn't funny, how to become the kind of woman who married well and never caused a scandal. Jean had an older brother, Butch, and a younger sister, Pat. The family lived in Westport, Connecticut, where the lawns stretched wider than most people's dreams, and the houses sat far enough apart that you could pretend you were the only people in the world. Jean attended St. Margaret's School, then the Unquoa School. She was sent to Brillantamont International School in Lausanne, Switzerland, where she spent 3 years learning to be the kind of cosmopolitan young woman who could navigate any drawing room in any country. She learned French until it flowed as easily as English. She learned Italian. She wrote poetry in journals no one would read, verses about night and loneliness that her school magazine published once, as if her interior life was something that could be contained in stanzas. She was being groomed for a very specific kind of life, one measured in country club memberships and suitable marriages and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd done everything right. But Jean had other plans. Or rather, she had a feeling that there had to be something more than this. Something that made her heart beat faster than any tennis match or society luncheon ever could. At 17, she made her society debut. It was September 24th, 1938, and she wore white, as was expected. She smiled at the right moments, danced with the right young men, said all the things a debutante should say. And inside, she was screaming with boredom. 2 months later, she was carrying a bucket of water across a Broadway stage. Her father had resisted at first. Acting wasn't for girls from good families. But Jean possessed something that would define her entire life, a quiet determination that looked like gentleness, but was actually steel. She studied with a Broadway director named Benno Schneider in a small Greenwich Village studio. She took whatever roles she could get. That bucket of water was her first Broadway appearance, in a play called What a Life. A variety critic wrote that she was certainly the most beautiful water carrier he'd ever seen. It wasn't exactly praise for her acting, but it was a start. By 1940, she'd landed a role in The Male Animal. The production was a hit, and Jean's face appeared in Life magazine. She was photographed for Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. At 19 years old, she was already something more than just another pretty girl trying to make it in show business. She was becoming an image, an idea, a fantasy. Broadway critics started paying attention. One called her a promising young actress. Another focused on her looks. They always focused on her looks. Jean's beauty was the kind that made people stop talking mid-sentence. High cheekbones that caught the light. An overbite that should have been a flaw but somehow made her more intriguing. And those eyes, green like sea glass, like something pulled from the ocean and polished smooth. One night, Darryl F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, came to see the show. During the performance, he told his assistant to note Tierney's name. He wanted to meet that actress after the show. Later that same night, at the Stork Club, he saw a young woman on the dance floor, moving with an elegance that seemed effortless, and told his assistant to forget the actress from the theatre and sign that woman instead. It was Jean Tierney. Zanuck hadn't recognized her. This would become a pattern in her life. Jean had a chameleonic quality, a way of transforming herself that went beyond makeup or costumes. She could be the ingenue one moment and the sophisticate the next, the girl next door, or the exotic temptress. People never quite knew what they were getting with Jean Tierney. She would later say she had several different looks, a quality that proved useful in her career. But what it really meant was that Jean Tierney was already disappearing, already becoming whatever people needed her to be. The girl from Connecticut who wrote poetry and dreamed of something more was receding. The image was taking over. Zanuck signed her to a contract with 20th Century Fox. Jean was 20 years old, and Hollywood had just opened its doors. But what was waiting for her there would be far more complicated than anything she'd imagined. The machine. Hollywood in 1940 was a machine that turned beautiful girls into stars and stars into products. Jean Tierney fed herself into that machine willingly. Her first film was The Return of Frank James, a Western directed by Fritz Lang opposite Henry Fonda. She was 20 years old and terrified. Lang was a tyrant on set, but Jean watched and learned. This was the price of the dream. The roles came quickly after that. Tobacco Road, where she played a barefoot hillbilly named Ellie Mae. Director John Ford cast her in a role that was all sexuality and earthiness, about as far from her Connecticut upbringing as you could get. The Shanghai Gesture, where she wore increasingly wild costumes designed by the man who would soon become her husband, playing a character who descended into alcoholic and sexual excess. Belle Starr. Sundown, where even the unflappable George Sanders looked momentarily undone by her entrance into a scene. Son of Fury. The studio was figuring out what to do with her. They'd cast her in westerns, melodramas, adventure films. Sometimes she was the good girl. Sometimes she was dangerous. The roles kept coming. But Jean was still learning, still finding her way as an actress. In 1941, she eloped with Oleg Cassini, a costume designer who worked at Paramount. He was handsome and charming, with dark eyes and continental manners. He came from European nobility, a count's son who'd fled the Russian Revolution as a child. He had sophistication and style, and a reputation for knowing his way around women. Her family was horrified. Oleg was Catholic, and Jean was Episcopalian. He was divorced, which meant scandal in their circles. He had a playboy reputation that preceded him wherever he went. This was not the suitable marriage Belle Tierney had spent years preparing her daughter for. But Jean was in love, or thought she was, or maybe just wanted to be free of all those expectations that had followed her from Connecticut to Broadway to Hollywood. They married anyway, in a quick ceremony that made headlines. For a while, it seemed like Jean Tierney had managed to outrun every expectation placed upon her. She was a movie star. She was married to a sophisticated European. She was working with the best directors in Hollywood. She was 20 years old and at the beginning of everything. The cracks came later. They always do. Oleg designed costumes for Jean's films when he could, creating elaborate gowns that made the most of her figure and colouring. He understood how to present her to maximum effect, but he also understood how to charm other actresses, and the rumours started almost immediately. Lana Turner, others. Jean tried not to listen to the gossip that seemed to follow her husband through every Hollywood party. Ernst Lubitsch cast her in Heaven Can Wait in 1943, opposite Donna Meche. It should have been her breakthrough into comedy, a chance to show she could do more than just look beautiful in melodramas. On set, Lubitsch screamed at her constantly, reducing her to tears. He was a perfectionist who believed in breaking actors down to rebuild them the way he wanted. When she threatened to walk off the picture, he yelled that he was paid to shout at her. She replied, with more steel in her voice than anyone expected, that she was paid to take it, but not enough. Lubitsch reportedly laughed, genuinely impressed, and they became friends after that. This was how it worked in Hollywood. You survived the cruelty, and if you survived it with enough grace, enough backbone, people respected you for it. Jean was learning the rules of a game she'd never wanted to play. But 1943 brought something Jean Tierney couldn't survive with grace or grit, or any amount of determination. The fan. She was pregnant with her first child and working on Heaven Can Wait. She kept the pregnancy secret because she feared being replaced. This was Hollywood. There was always someone younger, someone more available, someone who wouldn't need time off to have a baby. Jean had seen what happened to actresses who got pregnant at the wrong time. Their careers stalled. Younger women took their roles. The machine kept moving without them. Before leaving Los Angeles to join her husband Oleg, who was stationed with the army in Kansas, Jean decided to make one final public appearance. The Hollywood Canteen was a club where servicemen could meet stars, get autographs, dance with pretty girls, forget for a few hours that they were heading to war zones they might not return from. It was a patriotic duty. Everyone who was anyone in Hollywood took turns volunteering there. Jean went. The place was packed with young men in uniform. Some were barely 18. Some had already seen combat and had that look in their eyes, that distance that came from witnessing things no one should have to see. Jean moved through the crowd, signing autographs with her perfect penmanship, shaking hands, posing for photographs that these boys would carry with them overseas. She smiled until her face hurt. She listened to stories about hometowns she'd never visit. She danced with soldiers who held her too carefully, as if she might break. The boys were so far from home, and she could give them this small kindness, this moment of glamour and normalcy before they shipped out. A few days later, she woke up, covered in red spots. German measles, rubella. In 1943, there was no vaccine. Most people thought it was a harmless childhood disease, something you got as a kid and then forgot about. A week of spots and fever, and then you were fine. But just 2 years earlier, an Australian eye doctor named Norman Gregg had discovered something that would change everything. He'd noticed an unusual cluster of babies born with cataracts after a rubella outbreak swept through Sydney in 1940. 20-some infants, all with the same devastating eye damage, all born to mothers who'd had rubella in their first trimester. Gregg dug deeper. The virus, it turned out, could cross the placental barrier. It could attack a developing fetus during those crucial first months when the brain and organs and senses were forming. The damage was permanent, profound. Cataracts, deafness, heart defects, mental disability. This information was just beginning to circulate through medical journals in 1943. It hadn't reached the general public. There was no television news, no internet, no way for crucial medical findings to spread immediately to everyone who needed to know. Jean Tierney didn't know any of this. Her doctor didn't warn her to avoid crowds. No one told her what the red spots might mean for the child she was carrying. She rested for a week, recovered, and went to Kansas to be with Oleg. They made a home in Junction City, near Fort Riley, where he was stationed. Jean spent the next months preparing for motherhood, decorating a nursery, reading baby books, imagining the life they would have. On October 15th, 1943, in Washington, D.C., she gave birth to a premature baby girl. Antoinette Daria Cassini weighed 3 pounds, 2 ounces. She was so small, so fragile. She needed a complete blood transfusion immediately. The doctors ran tests, more tests. Their faces grew graver with each result. Finally, they sat Jean and Oleg down and explained what had happened. Daria was deaf, partially blind with severe cataracts, profoundly mentally disabled. The rubella, the timing, the way the virus had attacked the developing fetus during those crucial first months. There was nothing they could have done. Nothing they could do now. The damage was permanent. Jean listened to all of it, and something inside her broke that would never fully heal. This was her daughter. This tiny girl who would never hear music or see her mother's face clearly or understand the world the way other children would. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything, and instead, it felt like an ending. The encounter. Howard Hughes, the eccentric millionaire who had once pursued Jean romantically, paid for Daria's medical care. Despite his reputation as a recluse who cared about nothing but airplanes and money, Hughes made sure the little girl received the best treatment available. He covered all the expenses, never asked for publicity or gratitude. Just did it because he'd cared about Jean once, and this was something he could do. But there was no treatment that could give Daria the life her mother had dreamed for her. No amount of money or care could undo what the virus had done. For 2 years, Jean tried to care for Daria at home. She hired the best nurses money could buy. She read everything she could find about childhood development, about deafness, about brain damage, searching for some hint that her daughter might improve. She hoped against all medical evidence that Daria might somehow beat the odds, that love and determination might be enough. She brought Daria to specialists. She tried experimental treatments. She sang to her daughter even though Daria couldn't hear. She held her and rocked her and tried to find some connection, some moment of recognition in those clouded eyes. Nothing worked. Daria wasn't going to get better. She would need round-the-clock care for the rest of her life. Then came the tennis party. It was 2 years after Daria's birth. Jean was trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, attending social functions, seeing friends, pretending she wasn't falling apart inside. She was at a tennis club with friends when a woman approached her, beaming, gushing about what a huge fan she was. The woman kept talking, explaining that they'd met before, at the Hollywood canteen during the war. Jean didn't remember her. The canteen had been full of faces, hundreds of people, all wanting a moment with the stars. The woman seemed disappointed that Jean didn't recall their meeting. She elaborated, trying to make herself memorable. She'd been in the Women's Marine Corps, she explained. She'd been ill that night, actually, but she'd wanted to meet Jean Tierney so badly that she'd broken quarantine to attend. Just couldn't pass up the opportunity, you see. And then, almost as an afterthought, the woman asked if Jean had happened to catch German measles after that night at the canteen. Time stopped. Jean Tierney stood there and understood, for the first time, exactly what had happened to her daughter. This woman, this smiling, oblivious woman who'd been such a fan that she'd broken medical quarantine to meet a movie star. This single moment of selfishness, this one thoughtless decision, had destroyed Daria's life before it even began. She said nothing. The words wouldn't come. What could she say? What would be the point? Screaming at this woman wouldn't cure Daria. It wouldn't give back the hearing or the sight or the intelligence that the rubella had stolen. Jean Tierney turned and walked away. She never spoke to that woman again, never reported her, never sought revenge or justice or even an apology. She simply added it to the weight she was already carrying, this knowledge that her daughter's disability had a name and a face and had been completely, utterly preventable. In 1947, when Daria was 4 years old, Jean and Oleg made the decision to institutionalize their daughter. Daria would spend most of her life in care facilities. She would die in 2010 at the age of 66, having never known her mother as anything but a distant, sad presence who visited sometimes. Jean had a second daughter with Oleg in 1948. Christina was healthy, beautiful, everything Daria wasn't. But the damage to Jean's marriage was already complete. The portrait. The year 1944 should have been Jean Tierney's triumph. Laura premiered, and it made her a legend. Director Otto Preminger had cast her as Laura Hunt, a woman so magnetic that men became obsessed with her even after her supposed death. The film was a noir masterpiece, all shadows and obsession, and that haunting portrait of Jean's face hanging on the wall while everyone wondered who could have destroyed such beauty. In the film, Laura exists first as a painting, an idealized image that the detective falls in love with before she even appears. When Jean finally walks through the door, alive and real, the question becomes whether the woman can ever live up to the fantasy. It was the perfect metaphor for Jean Tierney's own life. The portrait that hung in the film, the one that became iconic, captured something essential about her. The green eyes that seemed to look past the camera, past the viewer, into some middle distance where the future waited. The slight smile that could mean anything or nothing. The perfection that didn't quite seem human. Critics raved. Audiences packed theatres. Jean Tierney became the woman every man wanted and every woman wanted to be. The image was complete now, seared into the public consciousness. She wasn't just a movie star anymore. She was an icon. But at home, she was watching her marriage disintegrate. The Hollywood that had brought Jean and Oleg together was now tearing them apart. Oleg's infidelities became harder to ignore. There were whispers about him and other actresses. Lana Turner's name came up. Others. Jean tried to pretend she didn't hear the gossip that seemed to follow her everywhere. They separated in 1946, came back together briefly when Jean wanted to try one more time to make it work, then separated again when she realized it never would. The marriage had survived Daria's birth, but it couldn't survive everything else, the guilt and blame and distance that had grown between them. Jean threw herself into work, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, where she played a widow who falls in love with a ghost. It was a role that let her be tender and strong, vulnerable, but not weak. Working with director Joseph Mankiewicz, she created one of her most affecting performances, The Razor's Edge, where she worked alongside Tyrone Power. Power was beautiful in the way Jean was beautiful, almost too perfect to be real. On set, they circled each other carefully. He was married. She was technically still married. And yet there was something there, a connection that went deeper than just two attractive people making a movie together. But nothing came of it. Jean was learning that in Hollywood, even genuine connections got complicated by contracts and publicity and the careful management of images. Nothing was ever just what it appeared to be. And then, in 1946, she met someone who would change everything. The Blue Eyes. His name was Jack Kennedy. He was a young Navy lieutenant visiting the set of Dragonwyck, and when Jean turned to look into the camera, she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen on a man. She would later write that her heart literally skipped. It was romance novel stuff, the kind of meeting that shouldn't happen in real life but somehow did. The director had told her to turn and look into the camera, and instead, she'd found herself looking at this man in a Navy uniform, and the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Jack Kennedy was 29 years old, charming in that effortless way that some men have, ambitious in a way that made everything else in his life secondary. He came from a wealthy Boston Irish family that was already planning his political future. His father, Joe Kennedy, had been ambassador to the court of St. James. The family had money and connections and a ruthless determination to accumulate power. Jean was still technically married to Oleg Cassini, though they were separated. She was Episcopalian. He was Catholic. She was a divorcee in the making. He was a man with his eye on the White House. His family would never approve of her. Her family had their own reservations about him. None of it mattered. They fell into an affair that consumed them both. Jean would take him to meet her mother in Green's Farms. Jack would bring along political associates, rough men from his father's world who left cigar stubs in ashtrays and talked politics with an edge that made Belle Tierney uncomfortable. These weren't the refined people Jean had been raised to associate with. These were ward healers and fixers, the machinery that kept politicians in power. Her mother couldn't hide her distaste. Once, she asked Jean's sister why Jack couldn't get a better class of people around him. The answer was simple. He was a politician, not on a polo team. This was his world, and it was never going to be the world Belle Tierney thought her daughter deserved. Jean's family saw what she couldn't, or wouldn't. This relationship had an expiration date written into it from the start. Jack was Catholic, and would need to marry a Catholic woman if he wanted his political career to survive. Jean was about to be divorced, which was political poison in the 1940s. She was an actress, which meant she was fundamentally unsuitable as a politician's wife in that era. And maybe Jean knew all this too. Maybe she loved him anyway. Or maybe she loved the idea of him, the beautiful man with the perfect blue eyes who made her feel like she was more than just a face on a screen. They dated for about a year. Jack would visit her when he was in New York or Los Angeles. They'd go to dinner at the Stork Club or other places where they'd be seen, because Jack understood the value of being seen with beautiful women. It added to his image, the war hero who dated movie stars. One day they were having lunch in New York. Jack had asked her to meet him, and Jean thought maybe this was it. Maybe he was going to propose, or at least talk about their future together. Just before some of his friends joined them at the table, Jack looked at her and said, out of nowhere, that he could never marry her. Just like that. Matter of fact. No preamble. His political career wouldn't survive a marriage to a divorced actress. His father would never allow it. The Catholic Church would never sanction it. Jean sat there as his friends joined them, making small talk, laughing at jokes she didn't hear. When it was time for Jack to leave for his flight back to Washington, she said very quietly, "Goodbye, Jack." The finality in her voice made him stop. He walked back across the room, asked her what she meant. She asked him what he thought she meant. There was a long moment where they looked at each other, both knowing it was over, but neither quite ready to say it out loud. The relationship limped along for a while after that. They'd see each other occasionally. Jean ran into him at El Morocco in 1956, years later, when she was deep in her mental health struggles. They danced. The next day, he visited her at her mother's apartment, and her mother was afraid to leave them alone, afraid Jean would get hurt again. Jack suggested they go for a walk. Outside, under the streetlights of Manhattan, they talked about her illness, about the path her life had taken. Jean told him she'd begun to realize she was one of those people who couldn't handle problems and disappointments by working harder, that maybe she needed to find a different way to survive. But the romance was finished. Years later, Jean would say that no one really broke them up. Not his father, not his mother, not her family. She stopped seeing him because she knew the consequences wouldn't be happy ones. She'd learned by then that sometimes loving someone isn't enough, that the world doesn't care about your feelings if the circumstances are wrong. When Kennedy became president in 1960, Jean sent him a congratulatory note. It was gracious, the kind of thing someone does when they've made peace with the past. She voted for Richard Nixon in that election. Some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding, but you remember exactly where they are. The Descent. By 1945, Jean Tierney had achieved everything a woman in Hollywood could achieve. She'd been nominated for an Academy Award for Leave Her to Heaven, where she played a woman whose obsessive love destroys everyone around her. Critics called her performance chilling. They had no idea how much of Jean's own darkness she was channeling into that role. The 1940s gave way to the 1950s, and the cracks began to show. She dropped out of Mogambo in 1953. The official reason was health issues, but everyone knew it was something more. Grace Kelly took the role and became a star. Jean Tierney started to disappear. On the set of The Left Hand of God in 1955, she couldn't remember her lines. Humphrey Bogart, her co-star, would feed her dialogue between takes. He was patient with her because his own sister had suffered from mental illness. He recognized the signs. After filming Wrapped, he told Jean privately that she needed help. She was hospitalized at Harkness Pavilion in New York, then the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut. The doctors prescribed electroshock therapy, 27 sessions. The treatment was supposed to cure her depression. Instead, it erased portions of her memory. Jean would later become a vocal opponent of electroshock therapy, speaking publicly about how it had destroyed parts of her life. But in the moment, she was drowning and grasping at anything that might save her. She fled from the Institute of Living. She was caught and returned. The cycle continued. Manic episodes where she couldn't stop spending money, buying things she didn't need, making plans she couldn't follow through on. Then the crashes, where she couldn't get out of bed for days, where the weight of everything she'd lost felt too heavy to carry. Her second daughter, Christina, came home from school one day in December 1957 to find their apartment building surrounded by police and neighbors. Jean was on the ledge of their mother's apartment, 14 stories up. For 20 minutes, she stood there, looking down. 20 minutes deciding whether to jump. She didn't. The police talked her down. She stepped back inside. But something had changed. Jean Tierney had reached the absolute bottom of her despair, and she'd chosen to live anyway. The healing. The Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, was different from the other institutions Jean had been in. They didn't just throw medication at her or strap her down for shock treatments. They tried to understand what was happening in her mind. They gave her space to heal. Part of her treatment involved working as a salesgirl at Talmadge's ladies' apparel shop in a nearby town. Anonymously, without anyone knowing she was Jean Tierney, Hollywood star. She helped customers find dresses. She made small talk about the weather. She practiced being a regular person again. It lasted until the press found out. Then the photographers showed up, and Jean's brief taste of normal life evaporated. She spent 18 months at the Institute of Living, then 8 months at Menninger. Slowly, carefully, she began to put herself back together. In 1958, she declared herself ready to work again. 20th Century Fox had continued paying her salary through all her years of absence, and now she returned to the studio that had made her a star. People rushed to greet her, to hug her, to welcome her home. In interviews, she spoke with remarkable frankness about where she'd been. She talked about breaking down, about treatment, about working in that dress shop. This was before it became common for celebrities to discuss mental illness publicly. Jean Tierney was breaking ground simply by admitting she'd needed help. She made a few more films. Advise and Consent in 1962, where she had a small but memorable role. The Pleasure Seekers in 1964, which would be her last theatrical film. But her heart wasn't in Hollywood anymore. She'd found something better. The Oil Man. His name was W. Howard Lee, and he was a Texas oil executive. He'd been married before, to actress Hedy Lamarr, a marriage that had ended badly in 1960 with a bitter court battle over alimony. Jean met Howard that same year, and they married on July 11th, 1960, at the Aspen Community Church in Aspen, Colorado. She was 39. He was 51. They were both wounded by their previous marriages, both looking for something quieter than what Hollywood offered. They settled in Houston, where Jean lived for the next 31 years. She wrote a newspaper column. She became an expert at contract bridge. She traveled with Howard. She participated in civic and charitable causes. It was, by all accounts, a happy marriage. Howard was steady, supportive, devoted. He helped Jean through the rough patches that still came, the days when the depression crept back in. He never asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. When Jean discovered she was pregnant in 1960, she and Howard were both overjoyed. She'd withdrawn from a film called Return to Peyton Place to prepare for the baby. But then she miscarried, and something in Jean broke all over again. She retreated from public life even further. She made a few television appearances over the years. Her final role was in the 1980 miniseries Scruples. By then, she was 60 years old and looked nothing like the ethereal beauty from Laura. Decades of smoking had taken their toll. Her hands shook. Her voice was rough. But she was still Jean Tierney, still capable of capturing something on camera that couldn't quite be explained. Howard Lee died on February 16, 1981, after a long illness. Jean was 60 years old and suddenly alone. She never remarried. Friends said she would sometimes call her first husband, Oleg Cassini, in the middle of the night and talk to him as if it were still 1943, as if none of the tragedy had happened yet, as if they were still young and in love, and Daria hadn't been born with those devastating disabilities. Jean published her autobiography, Self-Portrait, in 1979. In it, she wrote with painful honesty about her mental illness, her treatment, her failures as a mother, her regrets. She dedicated it to her daughters. Christina died in 2015 at age 66, the same age Daria had been when she died in 2010. Jean herself had died 14 years earlier. On November 6, 1991, just 13 days before her 71st birthday, Jean Tierney passed away in Houston from emphysema. She'd smoked for most of her life, starting after watching her first movie, because she thought her voice sounded too high and wanted to make it deeper. Even at the end, she was trying to transform herself into what she thought people wanted to see. The legacy. What do we make of a life like Jean Tierney's? There's the story Hollywood tells, the glamorous actress with the perfect face who fell from grace. There's the medical story, the woman with untreated bipolar disorder who suffered through barbaric treatments until she finally found help. There's the tragedy of Daria, the daughter who never had a chance because a fan broke quarantine. But maybe the real story is simpler and more complicated than any of those. Jean Tierney was a woman who spent her entire life becoming what other people needed her to be. The debutante her parents wanted. The star Daryl Zanuck created. The fantasy men projected onto movie screens. The cautionary tale of Hollywood excess. The brave survivor who spoke publicly about mental illness. She played all those roles brilliantly. But who was Jean Tierney when no one was watching? Did she even know? In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, there's a scene where Jean's character is told that the life she thought she'd lived was actually just a dream. Everything she believed was real turned out to be something else entirely. Jean Tierney's life had that same quality. The beauty that should have been enough, but never was. The fame that brought no peace. The moments of happiness that slipped away before she could hold on to them. She survived all of it. She found love again. She built a quiet life in Texas, far from the cameras and the constant scrutiny. She wrote her truth down and let the world read it. But the image of her from Laura, those green eyes staring through the camera, remains the thing we remember most. The fantasy, the dream girl, the most beautiful woman in movie history. Not the woman who stood on a ledge and chose to live. Not the mother who lost one daughter to illness and watched the other grow up while fighting her own demons. Not the survivor who spent years in treatment and came out the other side to tell her story. Just that face, just that image, just that impossible, ethereal beauty. Jean Tierney knew better than anyone how little beauty actually protects you, how it can become a prison of other people's expectations, how the world loves to build you up and watch you fall. She fell, and then she got back up, and then she lived another 30 years doing exactly what she wanted, away from all the noise. Maybe that's the real triumph. Not the Oscar nomination, or the iconic films, or the famous lovers, but the quiet decision to survive, to heal, to find happiness on her own terms. Jean Tierney's life was a tragedy, but it was also a victory. She lived to tell her own story, in her own words, and she lived long enough to find peace. That's something Laura never got. The dream girl in the painting, frozen in time, perfect and unreal. Jean Tierney was real, flawed and complicated and wounded and strong, and her story deserves to be remembered not just for the tragedy, but for the courage it took to survive it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.